Okay, good afternoon everyone. So today we'll be focusing on the discussion of the topics that I have already posted, because based on my uh, result of your exam and result of posted quizzes, there are some students who are not yet fully understand or don't have yet full understanding of the lesson. So the purpose of today's meeting is for you to be able to have a review, and our objective is to completely understand the content of our created module. Actually, medyo natagalan ako mag-develop ng module sa inyo kasi mahirap siyang i-discuss in a textual form. Mas madali siya i-discuss sa klase during face-to-face. Kasi yung the reference that I used are actually more than one, or let's say mga 5 references that I need to consolidate in order to identify the easy to understand terms and easy to understand sequence of lesson. Okay, so now let us identify our objective for today's meeting. Okay, so number one, we will be discussing, going back to the discussion of data modeling. Why is it necessary to create a data model, and what are the building blocks of a data model? And also, I will be demonstrating how to design a data model. So I will be using the draw.io, the online tool. So if ever you have a cell phone, medyo challenging siya kasi kailangan dito talaga gumagamit ka ng mouse to convert your design. But anyway, I also accepting design that are written, as long as it's readable. When you provide a picture of your design, make sure readable siya. So we'll be identifying some steps how to design data model, from business rules to transforming business rules into data model. And after this, I have several topics that are actually coming for the next period, yung relational data model, and etc. And part ng discussion is we are be going back to the SQL commands, mga advanced commands. Because this is a preparation of your subject that allows you to connect programs with databases. Kasi after this semester, we'll be undergoing to another subject that focuses on the system design, which is requires to develop programs that allows you to manage data from the database. Now, let's move forward. Okay. So let me open your module for week 3. So that's the primary reason why you are here. Okay. So in module 3, this is the starting point of our subject, which is the data model. So why is it necessary to develop data model? So let me give you a background why data model is important. So nakikita po ba yung screen ko? Nakikita po ba? Hindi lang siya ma-zoom, but is it visible? Okay lang. Oy guys, kayo nakikita niyo screen? Okay, thank you. Okay. You are seeing right now is my SQL Community Edition application that allows me to browse databases. So let me browse one database as an example. Okay. So I will be browsing the sample database called Marathon Skills. Okay. So now I'm going to display the sorry, mali na open ko. Let me close it and reopen a new one. Okay. Anyway, okay, wait lang. Okay. Okay, so the purpose of data model is to design your database. Okay, so let me give you a complete view of what a database design looks like if physically present na siya, meaning running na yung database. Okay? Okay. This is an example of a database for a marathon recording system. Ano po? Don't worry kasi hindi naman kayo gagawa nito. This is just an example para so that you could have a background. Why is it necessary to develop a data model? Okay. So notice nyo, there are several lines already that appearing in my screen. Arrange lang natin. So let us arrange this one. Okay. Okay. Ayan. Medyo madami siya. Okay. Dito natin sa kabila. Ayan. Okay. Doon sa SQL community, wala siyang capability to do this. That's why I closed my application a while ago. You need to have a full version of SQL. Okay. But anyway, so as you can see, this is now a working database for for example, enterprise companies. No? So this database contains data or records that actually being used for marathon skills. Okay, so let's examine each one. Notice nyo, this one, there are several tables. We call this table, or we call these entities that are available in the database. Each entity contains records of each no? So that allows us to manage the data. This is not like what we usually do in Microsoft Excel, that records are grouped together. So for example, let me give an example about a Microsoft Excel record. Okay, so let us compare. Para at least meron kayong you have a complete understanding why do we need to create a data model. Ito yung mahirap ilagay sa module, ang pag-discuss ng ganitong situation. Because it's really hard to explain things that requires demonstration. So that's why during this session, discuss ko siya sa inyo. Okay, so this is an example. Oh, mali na buksan ko. Saan ba yun? Okay. These are username password pala. Saan na yun? Okay, hanapin natin. Just like this. In an Excel format, okay, gawa na lang tayo ng bagong Excel. Okay, in an Excel document, this is suitable for small records that you can easily track record from Excel. But in complexity time or complexity requirements, hindi na natin siya pwedeng magamit because this has a limitation of just showing what the records is. Example, this one is a list of students. This is just an example. So as you can see, there are several records of students. Now, what if you need to add record of a student? In this example, you cannot just add a student without scanning record one at a time to examine if the data is already existing. Because in this particular example, this is what you call unstructured, meaning hindi pa siya na-arrange or hindi pa siya na-format into particular format that the company requires. When you add the data, let's say source gone, tapos numbers, etc., there is no validation involved. If you add a record, let's say talas, it's a good thing that Excel has this. But what if text file, etc., that contains millions of records, medyo mahirap siya i-format. And that's the purpose of creating an electronic database, because your data is organized according to its purpose. Example, these are the records of marathon. Let's say, for example, this is that entity for marathon. And you want to examine a record for that particular record only. So, let's examine. So, these are the records for the marathon. Okay, generate natin. So, ito yung record niya. Now, who are the people that are registered in this particular marathon skills, or who are the people that are registered in this particular event? Let's say, for example, 2015. No. In Microsoft Excel, it's really hard to do that because since this event happened going back from 2011 to 2015, which means there are plenty of users already enrolled. So at this case, if you try to examine, these are the people who are let us count how many people are present as registered user in our database. Let's say count. I'm just trying to count lang . So I'm not doing anything special here, just trying to count because I cannot identify. Okay, in this particular table, user. Sorry. Okay, so all in all, we have 5,092 registered user. But if you have to identify who are the people that are, or who registrants are registered in a particular event, like for example in marathon 2015, so who are they? So it's really hard to do that in a Microsoft Excel, but in a system or in a database form, madali natin siyang mahanap kasi nagkakaroon na tayo ng relationship. Example, marathon, event, registration, sino nag-register, and etc. So, madali natin siyang ma-identify. Using a system, we can easily connect one record to another record. And that's the purpose of relationship. That's why, as you notice, there are several entities that are connected to one another. Example, it's an example of one-to-many, which means one country can be hosting a particular marathon. So meaning, for example, Philippines can host several marathons. Okay, so that's what one-to-many is. So one record is connected to one or more records. Okay, so yun. So in this particular in my monitor, you are actually showing an example of a database with a relationship with one entity to another entity. Now, you might ask yourself, how does this database started? So this started from conducting investigation to the client up to designing a data model. So what now is a data model? So a data model is the primary diagram of developing a database. Hindi siya nagsisimula sa pupunta ka sa SQL Log, then gagawa ka ng table. So it's not like that. It's not how database design or doing like that. It's not how a database design task do that particular procedure. So what we do is we started from data modeling up to physical design. So a data model identifies the initial point of designing a database. This serves as the communication between designer and the database developer or database administrator. So the data model clarifies communication by reducing complexities of database design, more easily understood abstraction that defines entities, relation, and data transformation. Okay? So paano nagsisimula ang data model? So data model has actually several processes. So from database design, from creating a logical to physical design. So data model is actually under logical design. Okay? So yun. So paano ba siya nagsisimula? So when you develop a system for a client, we'll say enterprise application, so it's like asking the client what they really need. So since you are developing a product, part of developing a product is developing a program, and part of developing a program is to develop a database that allows us to store the data. So you start from the life cycle of developing a system. So identify or selecting the project identification, ano yung requirement ni client, your plan for developing the program, how or what are the requirements of the client to in order to use the program, or what are the requirements that needs to be present in the feature of the program. So part of doing that is the identification of what your database looks like. Okay, so in the database development process, we start in enterprise modeling. It's like creating an initial design for a database. After creating an enterprise model is just a simple analysis of the database that is being gathered from conducting an interview or initial planning. Okay, so after developing an enterprise modeling, you will develop a conceptual data model, and that's data modeling comes in. So after designing a data model, you will be developing a logical design. Yung sa logical design, dito na makikita yung identification ng logical structure ng isang entity, the connection of the table to another table, and so on. From logical design, doon na papasok yung physical design, which means you are ready to develop your database physically, which means magiging working database na siya as storage of data. And then, after developing physical design and definition, you will be implementing it into your program and maintenance. So that's the development process of database. So database design, let's go back, is the process of facilitating design, development, and implementation. So parang it's like building a house. If you are an architect, for example, before you build a house, you try to ask your client what are the specifications of the house that they need, and they develop an architectural plan. So that's how database looks like. When you design a database, you look into the specification of the system, the feature of the system, and the data that needs to be stored. And after that, you will be developing a model or initial design so that you can progress into a much important detail of the plan and convert that into physical database. Okay, that's how or what the procedure needs to undergo in order to develop a complete database. Okay, so what now is a data model? So data model, this is a representation of complex real-world data structure. Yung sa real-world data structure, ito yung makikita natin na ginagamit sa industry. So when a client asks you to develop a system for them, you try to identify what are the data involved into that particular system. Sample, an enrollment system. So what are the data involved? The record of students, the subjects, the course, the payments, the accounts. So there are basically several data involved on a particular system. So that's the purpose of creating a data model, identifying the initial structure in order to develop the complete design for a database. So data model, you are creating an abstraction of real-world object. Okay, so it is the initial step in order for you to understand how complex your database looks like in the real application. So it's like when you draw a particular building, you try to identify its building blocks, like ano ba yung magiging sukat niya or size, etc. Ganun din sa database. Ano yung magiging initial data na dapat i-maintain hanggang nag-expand siya into several entities. So, data modeling is the first step in the database design. So, refers to the process of creating a specific data model to determine problem domain. Okay? So, please try to understand that since this is initial process, it is an iterative or progressive process, which means your initial plan might be the correct one, but by doing initial plan, you try to identify the sequence that needs to be done in order to develop a correct design for your database. Why do we need to design or to develop a data model? The purpose of that is to ensure that the objects that you develop or the table that you develop are accurate as possible. So, since initial design siya, you try to eliminate the non-important to important ones. Okay? So, it allows us to help to design the database at the conceptual, logical, and physical levels. So, since this is the starting point ng when you develop database, this is the initial process before you create a conceptual, logical, and physical levels of the database. Okay? Okay. So I'm not going to read all the contents of the module. I'm just going to discuss the most important ones. So there are several types of data model. Okay, so we have conceptual. Okay, when you design a conceptual model, it's really important that you have a background of what your database is. In my example, I have here a model for a student who enroll in a course. But you might ask yourself, saan ba to galing? So again, if we go back to the procedure, nag-i-start siya doon sa system development life cycle. You go to your client, you interview a client, and you ask what are the needed data for that particular system or program. From there, you try to take note what are the data need to be stored in your database. And then, dun ka na sa data model mag-identify ng kailangan mo mga data. So in this case, since this is an enrollment system, so you need a data for a student and a course. So in this case, this is an example of a data model that a student enroll in a course. So as you notice, we have entity. So student enroll in a course. So notice, wala pa siyang masyadong detailed part like relationship, one-to-many, and so on. All you have to do is just to develop a model that allows you to have a picture what will be your final database or initial database looks like. So therefore, in this particular example, you try to imagine, when I develop database, it must have a course and a student entity. And both of those tables are connected so that we can track students who are enrolled in a particular subject or course. Because there are students that are not enrolled in a course, and there are students that enrolled in several courses. So that's the purpose of designing a data model. Okay? After you create a conceptual model, that's the time you create a logical. So in this case, you will be building a relational diagram like in this one. This is now a detailed version of your data model. In this case, you have fully understand how the table is connected to another table and what are the data that must be present in an entity. Example, if you are trying to collect a data per student, there are several things that you need to be collected, like last name, first name, and etc. etc. But in this example, we just try to minimize example so that it will not take long for us to develop. Okay. So the purpose of logical model is to describe how database will be structured in your database management system. So in this case, we have provided three entities: the student, the course, and we have now an extra entity. The purpose of this extra entity, the enrolled entity, is for us to be able to record who students enroll into a particular course, what year, what semester, and what grades that the student earned during the time he enrolled in that particular course. Okay, if you have question later, we will try to answer that. Just put some list muna so that later pag-usapan natin isa-isa. Okay, so after you are done doing a logical design, gagawin mo na siya into physical model. So ganito na siya. So there are not much changes, but in this particular model, ito na yung gagawin or gagamitin ng mga programmer to reference when you develop the database, ano yung mga specific functionality and ano yung mga data type na dapat ilagay sa isang database. Kumbaga, the final design that you are going to develop is the physical data model. If this time you are ready to go to your software and create your database. For example, in this particular example, let's say you are now ready to construct your database. Example, we have here an example table. So in a physical model, you already indicated the data type, the column name, the length, the requirements like primary key, not null, etc. So you are going to mention that in your physical data model. So in the industry, there are several people involved in designing database. We have the database designer, the database developer, and the database administrator. The designer is responsible for doing these processes. Okay? And the database developer is responsible to transform this design into physical actual database, and the administrator is responsible for monitoring the complexity, the maintenance, and how well your database is being used in a particular enterprise system. Okay, so which means in creating your database, there are several steps involved. So, conceptual, logical, and physical data modeling. Okay, so now let us try to identify when the time that I need to develop a data model, what are the things that I need to know first? So the first thing you need to know in designing a data model is the building blocks. How do we build a data model? First, you must identify entity. So entity, these are anything that which data are to be collected. Example, I'm going to develop a library system. So a library system involves the following entities. Number one, books, the users or the borrowers, the transactions of borrowing or returning books, something like that. So, ibig sabihin, so which means entity are concerned with the things that the system that needs to be collected or needs to be recorded. So, example, a person, a place, a thing, a concept, or event for which the data can be stored. Aside from entity, you need also considering the attribute, which means if I'm going to collect information about a person or the borrower in a library, what are the needed data so that I can provide information about a certain borrower. Like a borrower needs to have a borrower name, an address, a contact number, an email, something like that. That's what you call attribute. Okay, so in an example, let me give an example. So let's say, for example, I have an example library here. Okay, so example, this is book example. Okay, so our entity is books and our attribute is now ISBN, title, author, abstract, and so on. So that's the building block. In database model, we are not yet concerned about the data type, etc. What we are concerned about is important things that we need to add into our model. Like, uh, uh, it's not yet detailed. For example, let's say a borrower. We just need to have a borrower name, last name, etc. or contact number. That's it. That's the primary requirement in attribute. We will be getting a much more detail on that if we go to the next process, the logical model. But for conceptual model, what important is you try to identify the entities, the attributes, and last, relationship. So relationship is the association, meaning the connection of one entity to another entity. So that's the purpose of that. Why do we need to include relationship? The purpose of relationship is to connect one data to another data. So let's have an example. So in our example is, let's have some diagram first. Okay, books, and let's say user. Let's say kung meron siyang, wala. Borrow transaction. Okay. Hanap tayo ng iba na meron. Hindi pa ata ito tapos. Hanap tayo. Ito na lang sa marathon. Okay, for example, marathon. So we have marathon. Okay, and we have event. Okay. Okay. So in this case, as you notice, we have marathon. This entity here provides information about the marathon. Let's say marathon 2011, etc. In this one, the events of a certain marathon. As you notice, a marathon title contains several events. So let's examine what event looks like. Okay, so this is now the event. We have fun run, 5-kilometer marathon, half marathon, full marathon. So how do we identify if this particular marathon, let's say Humber Fun Marathon, belong to a particular marathon? So we have here an ID that connects this record to the marathon entity. So we have here, so let's say for example, let's open the same table together. Okay. Okay. So connect natin. Okay. So buksan natin yung marathon. Okay. So as you notice, Marathon Skills 2011 happened in New York. Okay. Held 2011. The events involved in this marathon are the following. So we are looking for marathon ID number 1. Okay. So in this case, the marathon involved in that particular, the event involved in that particular marathon are the following: the host marathon, Humber Marathon, and FOS. We easily identify that because of the connections that they have. So for example, if we try to develop a query, it's easier to gather information. Okay, so for example, let's look for the marathon. Okay, I'm going to make it as faster as possible, ha? Okay, para madali. So for example, I want to identify the event for marathon skills. So marathon name and marathon year. Okay. And I want to identify the event of this marathon. So punta tayo sa event. Event name. Okay, and date. Let's say date. Okay, now I'm going to join them together. This is advanced query, so don't worry yet. So what I'm doing right now is I'm going to demonstrate how the data is being extracted from several tables. This is ano pala, marathon. Okay, so let's try to display. So where in the marathon ID equals 1. So let's try to execute. So as you notice, I can now identify which events that are belong to Marathon Skills 2011. By doing so, I can easily connect one record to another record, and that's the purpose of relationship. Do you get it now? So that's the reason why in data modeling, we try to establish relationship from one entity to another entity. Because as you can see, it's not like Excel that these records are merged together. So the purpose of separating one record to another record is for us to minimize inconsistency, avoid duplication of data, because when you merge these two, there are possibilities that the record will be like this: duplicate marathon skills but different event. So the primary reason why we separate one table to another table is to avoid this one. As you can see, there are multiple events, there are multiple content or data that displayed in my result that named after Marathon Skills 2011. So if we examine the table about marathon, we only see one record, only one, Marathon Skills 2011. But when we use the program and retrieve a record, we can easily determine which event that are connected to that particular marathon. So, clear na po ba? Clear? That's the purpose of relationship. Connection between one table to another table. So, that's why meron tayong relationship. Clear po ba? Clear. Clear? Kayo dyan, clear ba? Naintindihan? Sure? Sure ka mo? Bakit may relationship? Okay. Okay. Now, there are several types of relationship. We have one-to-one, or one-to-many, many-to-many, and one-to-one. Okay. What is one-to-many? Which means one record is associated to several records in an entity, and the symbol for that is 1 and M. So one-to-many means one record is related to several records into another entity. Many-to-many means association between two or more records to another occurrences of one record and another record to another table. That is many-to-many. It's like a Facebook social networking. I have several friends that I am connected, and they are also connected with several people. Hindi lang ako. So parang ganun. These are parang an arrangement of degree of relationship, no? So many to many. Okay, one to one. Okay, one to one is, which means the association is one only, which means if I have an account and it requires me to maintain only one account, so one to one. Okay, let's say profile connected to account, and you only need to have an account So that is one-to-one. Example, you only have one account in your Facebook profile, and you only have one username and password. That is one-to-one. Okay. Next, constraint. When you say constraint, this is a restriction placed on the data. So this is very important because it allows us to practice data integrity. So what is data integrity? Data integrity means, let me explain it this way. Now, in this example, we have marathon, an event of a marathon. Do you think it's possible to create an event without creating first a marathon? It's like, pwede bang mag-exist yung anak ng walang parents? No, right? So that's what you call integrity of data. Integrity means you are ensuring that the data that is being put inside your entities are part or legitimate data that needs to be put in there. So there is no data that being let's say null, etc. It's like when you add a record to a particular table, it's a must that it's connected to another set of table. Okay, to avoid anomalies. That's the purpose of constraint, para maiwasan yung mga data anomalies. Halimbawa, imagine this is a bank account, and this is your transaction, this is your account. No? This is your deposits. Is it possible that you can have a money without having an account? Or is it possible that you have deposited but you don't have any account yet? It's not possible. You should have an account first, and if you have an account, you can deposit, record a deposit transaction. And you cannot perform deposit transaction without making your account active. That's what you call integrity of the data. It's ensuring that the rules are being followed. Okay? So I guess clear na siya, ano? Okay. Okay. Business rules. What is business rules? Why is it important? This is important because this is the reason why we can develop data model. Because data model came from identifying the business rules. Okay? So business rules are description, policies, or a principle within a specific organization. Why is it important? Because important siya because this is where you select or determine what are your entities are, the attributes in the entities, and the relationship in that particular entity. Which means when you develop a data model, this is where your information, how to build your data model came from a business rules. Okay, so let's have some example. Okay. Let's say for example, this is an example of a business rule. Okay, according to your source, when you conduct investigation, in a class, a professor advises many students. It's like Sir Elvin advises BSIT. So, BSIT has several students. That is your business rules. Now, in developing a data model, this is where your model came from. This is very important that you must understand how to develop this one so that it would be easier for you to develop a data model. Okay, let's proceed. Example, a professor advises many students. So, each student is advised by one professor. So, as you can see, we can easily develop data model because in a business rules, it's already mentioning what entity, relationship are being present in our business, in our data model. Clear? So, you might ask yourself, Sir, how do we develop business rules? Paano ba siya ginagawa? So, paano ba siya ginagawa? So, unang-una, you need to identify saan siya galing. Okay? Saan siya galing? So, it came from, of course, your source of data. Company managers by conducting interview, policy makers, department head. Basically, if you want to develop a system with a database, you basically ask question your client. What are the data that needs your system to be stored? Okay, they will be explaining, ganito, when I have when you develop a library system, gusto ko, when a borrower borrows a book, pwede siya mag-borrow na hanggang 3 lang. So, those are business rules. So, a book can be borrowed by a borrower or a borrower, something like that. Book and borrower. So, those two are now your entities. Borrow means that is your transaction, that is now your relationship, right? So that's the purpose of, or that's the way how to extract a business rules coming from a interview or sources coming from your client. Okay, so the purpose of doing that is for you to be able to standardize the view of the data. What are the needed entities and the data and so on. And for you to be able to communicate between users and designer. Most especially sa mga nagde-develop ng database, this is very important because this is how you confirm that your data is conforming with the requirements of the client. Sir, when I design your database, tama po ba na sa system nyo kailangan merong professor, merong student, merong class? If they say yes, then nasa tamang track ka. Ano po, if you are developing an enrollment system. Okay? So, it allows the designer to understand business processes. Hindi pwede na paggagawa ka ng system, hindi mo alam yung sistema ng business. Example, in a library system, hindi ka pwedeng magbaro ng libro hanggat hindi ka member ng library. So, that's policy. So, meaning, in your system, when a borrower tries to borrow a book, he or she needs to be recorded, or he or she has to have a record of her account in the library system bago siya makapagbaro ng book. That's the rule. So that's also the reason why in business rules, yan yung initial processes in developing a system. Now, how do we translate business rules into data model as I mentioned a while ago? First, in your business rules, unang-una kayo ang gagawa ng business rules. You are going to interpret what your customer gives you. Try to understand that your client is not a IT person. So, their explanation is somewhat different from what you expect. But for you, since you have a background in database design, you should be the one who develop business rule based on the idea given by your client. Now, let's say for example, you have constructing now business rules. Now, how do we translate business rules into data model? So, first, you need to identify the nouns first. Nouns is now become your entity. And verb is now your relationship. And the relationship should be bidirectional, meaning from one entity to another entity, from entity number 2 to entity number 1. Vice versa, kumbaga. So the two questions to identify the relationship type: how many instances of B are related to instance of A? How is that? Which means, how many instances of marathon can be present in event entity? So in this case, as you notice in our display of data, marathon name appears 3 times. Okay? As the result, 3 times. So that is one too many. That's now the question that you need to ask. Is your entity can have many connection from one table to another table or not? How many instances of A are related to one instance of B? So that's what you call bidirectional relationship description. Okay? So example, this is now bidirectional. A professor advises many students and each student is advised by one professor. So as you can see, in the business rules, a professor advises many students, meaning one professor, many students. The relationship is one professor, many students. Okay? So, let's try to create a new slide, and let me illustrate that using a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Okay, so for example, so this is now your entity for a professor. So which means a record in your professor entity can be used to connect records from student entity. So this is now your student, this is now your professor. Which means this student can be part of the department that is being monitored by this professor. Kaya one-to-many siya. Okay? So that's the purpose of constructing business rules. You try to identify the initial design for your data model by constructing business rules. So nouns are entity and verbs are relationships or relationship, and the attribute is not yet mentioned here. The most important thing that you need to consider is here is the entity and the relationship. So business rules. Business rules are used to define entities, attributes, relationship, and constraints. So that can be part of the business rules. Usually, though, they are used for organizational that stores or uses data to be an explanation of policies, procedure, or principle. So usually, dun mo siya makikita. So that those are description of the policies, procedure, and principle. Okay. So ibig sabihin, para makatulong sa iyo ang pag-construct ng business rules, hanapin niyo yung policy, procedure, and principle ng company or ng client mo. Okay? Example, si client. When a borrower tries to borrow a book, he or she needs to return unreturned books first before she can perform another transaction. That is another policy. So, pwede ka doon maglagay ng explanation mo sa business rules mo na a borrower can borrow several books. But in a system, pag gumawa ka na ng isang system or program, doon mo na ilalagay yung policy na dapat yung borrower bago mag-borrow ng another transaction, dapat na-return niya muna yung mga unreturned books niya. So that's the purpose of creating business rules. So the data can be considered significant only after business rules are defined. Okay, so you need to define your business rules first. Okay, when creating business rules, keep them simple, easy to understand, and keep them broad. Okay, as you notice, this is now your business rules, easy to understand, broad, because you can easily identify which entities are and which is relationships are. Okay. So, example, professor must teach many classes. So, ayan siya. One-to-many. Okay. Each class must be taught by one professor. Okay. Example number 2. So, in this case, this is now your business rules, and this is now your data model. Okay. A sales representative, a sales meaning singular, must write many invoices, meaning madami, many. That's why sales rep writes many. So therefore, dito yung kanyang symbol. 1, mandatory. This one is mandatory 1. Pag dalawa ang linya, mandatory. Ano po? And also, many, mandatory many siya. Okay. Pwedeng isa or marami. Each invoice has to be written by one sales representative. That's why it's called double line kasi mandatory. Hindi pwede mag-exist an invoice nang walang sales representative. That's the constraint. Each sales representative must assign many departments. Each department has only one sales representative. Okay, so that's why sales representative assigned to department and each department has only one sales representative. So that's why ganito siya. Okay? So one representative, many department. A customer has to generate many invoices. So, customer generate many invoices. Each invoice, when you say invoice, it's a transaction that the clients needs to pay, something like that. So, pwede kasing ang invoice is like ang payment ng customer is pwedeng more than once niya gagawin, like parang hinuhulugan niya yung payment niya, kaya ang tawag is invoice. Kaya pwedeng, ang pagbayad is pwedeng maraming beses siya magbayad hanggang makumpleto niya yung payment. So that's why one to many siya. Okay. So this is now the description of the relationship, or what we call cardinality. This is the symbol for mandatory one, I have mentioned a while ago. Mandatory many. Optional, meaning ng optional, pwedeng may record sa table na hindi kailangan parte rin ng record sa kabilang table. That's what we call optional. Okay? And optional many. So, pwedeng one lang or pwedeng marami. Just like in borrowing a book, pwedeng isa lang or pwedeng wala or pwedeng marami. Something like that. Okay, so that is about data model. In this module, hindi ko masyadong nalagay lahat. Okay, this is just introduction of what data model and business rules is. In the next module, I already mentioned how to construct them. That's why in my activities, it's important that you literally understand the concept of data model, the building blocks, before trying to build them. Okay, so let's try accessing the designing data models. Okay. Okay, designing data models. Okay, review siya ng concept. Nowadays, there are several ways to design a data model. You can use UML, but I'm used to data model because that's the industry standard of designing database. But some of the enterprise modeling system like UML are now being used to design database. Now, in this module, I already mentioned the recap, and in this module, aside from creating a data model, I already mentioned that there are actually ways to design a data model. Aside from that, you can also design your model using relational entity relationship type. So just like this one. So it's the same with what I mentioned a while ago. So in this particular model, it is what we call entity relationship diagram, or ERD. So graphical representation of an entity relationship. Okay. So as you can see in this particular diagram, okay, so let us zoom in. So which means supplier can send shipment, but it's not mandatory. Which means there are several suppliers here, but minsan kasi there are several suppliers that are limited with their products. Example, I have a supplier of soft drinks, which is Coke, although I have also another supplier called, let's say, XYZ supplier, but they are very limited to a certain products. That's why it's not mandatory relationship, because not all the records here are part of their product, or not all the transactions that they develop or they do are their own transaction. So there are several suppliers also that perform transaction. That's why this is optional. Okay. So supplier, supplies, item. So notice nyo, hindi lahat ng items sinusupply niya. That's why hindi siya mandatory relationship. So that's the purpose of identifying the correct constraint type. Okay. So product, okay. Item used in product, request, okay. Customer request or submits an order. In order, this is somewhat not mandatory because not all the items in the department store binibili natin, di ba? So, ibig sabihin, part lang ng product nila ang binibili nyo, hindi lahat. So that's an example. Okay, so yun. Again, balikan natin. Dito, mas detail na siya. Entity, example, person like student, employee, client, customer. Object like couch, airplane, machines. Kasi pwede nating i-store yung mga let's say inventory of computers. So, one entity is computer. Ano yung computer? Ano yung specification niya? Like memory, speed. So, yun yung mga data pwede nyo ilagay as attribute doon sa computer. Place, it can be part, etc. Let's say event. There's an event. So, meron siyang event and they are belong to a particular city. So, they can be also entities. Event, like, etc. So, concept, project, account, course. So, those are example of entities that you can develop in your database design. So, I have several examples here in detail. So, I hope naintindihan at nabasa nyo ng maigi. So, in developing an entity, it should be an object that will have many instances. Okay, like person, employee, student, which means they have several records that they need to maintain, like this one. So, maraming instances like si Michelle, si David. These are what we call instance of the entity. An object that will be composed of multiple attributes. Okay? And object that we are trying to model. Ano mga hindi pwede? User of the database. Hindi pwede. Okay? So, output of the database system like report. Because report came from the data. So, hindi siya pwede. Like, gagawa ka ng entity, ilalagay mo summary report of last year's inventory. No. Kasi inventory came from the data itself. Okay. Attribute. So, these are attributes. Ano mga pwedeng ilagay? In a data model, hindi tayo madalas maglalagay ng detail kasi ilalagay natin siya sa isang logical design. Hindi practical na gagawin mong data model ganito. Because medyo mahirap siyang ilagay. Instead, ang ginagawa natin ay nilalagay yung full detail ng attribute doon na sa logical model. But anyway, example ng mga attributes are the following types: composite or simple, isa lang. Okay? So, simple or atomic attributes. Composite means in one attribute, we can extract several attributes. Example, in address, pwede mong ilagay street, city, state, etc. That's what you call composite. Okay? Pag sinabing simple, isa lang na data. Pero pag composite, pwede ka pa mag-extract ng several data out of that attribute. Okay? So, single value, which means isang value lang sa isang attribute. Multi-value means multiple data in one attributes. Okay? So, what is a key attribute? Every time that we develop an entity, there must be an identifier. Example, what's the purpose of identifier? The identifier serves as or represents the table itself. Let's say, for example, Marathon ID. The purpose of Marathon ID here is for us to be able to link this table to another table. As you can see, we can easily identify which event is connected to Marathon because of the ID of the Marathon. So, let's go back to the record. So, event, we have event. Okay. So, which means these three event, the Humber, the Fast, the Aus Marathon, is actually part of a particular marathon because of this ID. So, which means part siya ng Marathon Skills 2011 because the ID that belongs to this Marathon Skills 2011 is actually linked to these three events. So that's the purpose of ID or key attributes. Okay, let's go back to our lecture. If you have question, listan nyo lang ha. List them out para later ma-access natin. Okay, candidate key, this is like a secondary key. So, in your data model, you can mention that by adding underline. Okay. Relationship, so, is an association among several entities. So, takes, has, it depends how you describe the relationship. Okay, something like that. So, degree. So, unary, pag sinabing unary, yung relationship mo, babalik din sa kanya. Example, this is what you call unary. Let's say for example, pag sinabing unary, let's say for example, we have unary example, relationship. Let's say for example, we have an entity, employee. Okay, employee. Sa employee na to, meron tayong mga list of records. Si Juan, Jose, Pedro, at si Jane. So, si Juan. Yan yung mga record niya. Juan, si Jose, si Peter, at si John. Si John. Okay. Now, pag sinabing unary, yung connection niya ay itself. Okay. Ibig sabihin, one of this person managing these persons. Ibig sabihin, si John ay pwedeng minamanage niya si Peter, si Jose, si Juan. Hindi na kasi pwede na gagawa pa tayo ng isa pang entity, tapos i-connect natin, tapos sasabihin natin, yung employee nandito, tapos yung manager nandito. These two are the same person, correct? What I mean is, the same record. So why do you need to separate them when you can put all the records in one entity and create a relationship that describes who is the person who managing all the person inside the entity? Gets? That's what you call unary. Binary means the relationship is entity 1 to entity 2. Unary, entity 1 to itself. Ternary means entity 1 is related to entity 2 and also related to entity 3. This is what you call unary. Okay? Ganyan. So, this is now your cardinality. So, this is what a relationship cardinality explains all about. Pag sinabing 1-to-1, ganyan siya. Isang instance. Okay? Pag sinabi naman 1-to-many, isa, pwede sa lahat or pwede sa iba. 1-to-many. Pero hindi naman siya mandatory. Pwedeng mandatory, pwede hindi mandatory. Many-to-one is the reverse version. But many-to-many is like this. Parang Facebook. Ako, friend ko siya, friend ko din siya, pero siya, friend niya yun din yung iba. Ganon. Okay? That is many-to-many. So that explains our module in week 4. Okay? So dito, dinidescribe din anong kailangan i-consider pag mag-a-add ka ng relationship, anong mga symbol, mandatory, not mandatory. Ano po? So yun. Okay, so now, let's have some anyway, nabasa nyo ito siguro, yun nandito. Let's have some example. I prepared a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. Sa data modeling. Saan ba? Okay. Since you already read the modules for week 3 and 4, so this lecture assumes that you already read and understand the concept discussed in previous lecture, data model topic. So, okay, during this activity, we'll be cover how to design and create database from a problem description. So, this is different now kasi meron siyang problem description. So, ngayon, gagawa tayo ng business rules. Kung dati, yung ating business rules ay binigay ko, ngayon ay mag-extract tayo ng business rules. Okay? Now, From business rules, database design model. So designing database before you create any table is an important step. It ensures problems when querying or keep to a minimum. Okay. So last time, ito nirecap ko na kanina. Ano po? Okay, problem number 1. So let's have some example. So this is now a problem statement. So this is now the client will give you when you develop or design a database. Ito yung madalas in-explain niya. So I have a database to be made to store information about catalog of CDs. Information to be stored about each CD includes their title, price, genre, and a list of tracks. Each CD will also have an artist, and each artist may produce several CDs. Tracks will have a title and the number of time in seconds, and artists have names associated with them, and it should be possible to search the database by artist by names. Now, this is somewhat very complicated in your part because since this is your first time, let me extract information one at a time. Now, in this example statement, we will be trying to create business rules out of this summary. So, paano natin yon gagawin? So, let's continue. After reading and understanding the scenario, you have to identify number 1. From that statement, you need to identify business rules from the given problem. Ano ba yung mga business rules na na-mention niya? Number 2, from business rules, identify entities, attributes, and relationship. Okay? And number 3, design data model that represents the result in step number 1 or number 2. Okay? So, next, expand the data model to AR model. But anyway, we will be covering this next module pa. So, steps 1 to 3 lang muna tayo. Okay. Now, step number 1, discover business rules from the given problem. So dito, we can easily identify business rules. So, erase natin. Okay. So, madali natin siyang mahanap kasi nagbabanggit na siya ng mga business rules. Okay. CD. Okay, CD, meron na siyang attribute. Mga attributes. Meron tayong catalogs of CD. Okay. And tracks, meron dapat siyang track. So CD, dapat meron siyang tracks. And CD have artist, di ba? That is business rules already. And each artist may produce several CDs. See? So, how can you do that? By identifying statement, understanding them, and look for business rules that you can find. So, let's move forward. Okay, step 1, business rules. So, tandaan, business rules is a brief, precise, and unambiguous, hindi dapat umulit na description of a policy, procedure, or principle. So, from that particular problem statement, we can easily extract the following business rules. So, bidirectional tayo. So, an artist produces CDs. This is now your entities. Verb. Diba? So, each CD. So, an artist meaning one, several, many. Diba? So, each CD produced by an artist. So, basically, this is now your artist. This is now your CD. So, gagawa ka ng relationship, produces, etc. Then, CD, one to many. Okay? Something like that. Okay? So, from here, gagawin mo siya ganito. But since they are connected, kasi may track pa daw, each track, gagawa ka ng track. Track. Hindi yung track na tumatakbo Ito yung mga pangalan ng kanta. Okay? So, track, part of a CD. CD pala siya. Okay, so let's erase. Okay. Gawa tayo. Okay. Oops, eraser pala yun. Okay. So, gagawa ka na ng track. Okay. Each, meaning one, part of A, C, D. Okay. Meaning, meron ka na ang relationship. Para malaman yung kanyang cardinality, each, okay, spelling. Each CD contains many tracks. Okay, many. Ayan. So, each track, part of a CD. So, one. Okay, gets na? Gets na? Okay, next is, now, after creating a business rules based on a problem specification, step 2, identify entities. Yung ginawa ko na kanina. Identify entities, attributes, and relationships. These steps allows you to identify entities, attributes, and relationship. Okay, how do we do that? It is necessary to identify cardinality ratios of the relationship found. For example, CD and artist are two entities from the problem above. Artist has an attribute name. So, and there also a relationship between artists and CDs. Artists produce CDs. So, yan ang relationship nila. So, that is one to many. So, from that, pwede na tayo makapag-extract ng ganitong information. So, anong doon ang entity? So, artist and CD. So, relationship, one to many. Artist, attributes niya, name. So, therefore, sa CD, ang entities niya, CD, attributes, title, price, genre, tracks, artist name, something like that. So, parang gagawa kayo ng table. So, in that case, magiging ganito na siya. Artist, produce CD, and CD contains tracks. Okay? Clear? Clear na po? From step 1 to step 3. Question, yung mga nandito, malinaw na ba? Malinaw na? Okay na? Malinaw na sa inyo? Okay. So, I guess mas naging clear na siya kaysa nung dati. Kasi ang iba tamad daw magbasa. Medyo nahirapan magbasa. Okay. But anyway, that's the entire content. Ako talaga sa totoo lang, I have several resources. Kaya medyo mahirap sa akin mag-incorporate. Kasi kung titingnan nyo yung libro, medyo mahirap siya. Pakita ko sa inyo yung libro kung saan ako kumukuha. Talagang ini-interpret ko pa siya para madali niyong maintindihan. Kasi ang hirap niya i-translate into module. Bigyan ko kayo ng example. Okay, saan na kayo? Medyo mahirap translate. Kaya i-appreciate nyo, basahin yung module kasi shortcut version na siya. Okay. Okay, pakita ko lang So, now, at least you have now understanding of how this particular database here in my computer are being developed. Kasi it's not really easy to develop database unless you start from the very beginning. Okay? So, it's not like what I have done before in the past that I already give the table name, the attribute, and what you did is punta kayo sa SQL, tapos gagawa kayo. But in real world scenario, kayo talaga ang gagawa mag-isa. Wala nang Sir Elvin na magsasabi, ito table gawin mo. So, the very first step that you need to undergo in designing database is to conduct investigation, identify business rules, develop data model, convert to logical model, and develop a physical design. Okay. Okay, ito yung libro na ginagamit ko, kaso medyo complicated siya. Since matagal na rin ako nagtuturo nito, so alam ko na kung paano siya ituro, kaya lang hirap niya gawin sa module. Ano po? So, mahirap siyang i-explain. Pag babasahin mo lang, gagawin ko lang yung chapter. Ano po? So, medyo mahirap ang content niya intindihin. Kaya, as much as possible, yung module talaga, ang dami kong resources. Okay. I even have a PowerPoint presentation of this. Ayan. Okay, saan na ba yun? Puntahan natin yung topic niya sa data model para makita niyo yung complexity na pinagdadaanan ko. Ito, chapter 2, data model. Ayan. Hindi ko sa diniscuss dati sa information management kasi hindi nyo ma-appreciate ang database pag nag-start kayong mag-data modeling. Ito yung topic niya, data model. Ayan. Importance. Daming basahin, ano? Ang dami. Oh. Ayan. Kung pwede ko lang ikatong libro tapos gawin kong module, ibigay ko sa inyo, pwede. Kaya lang, ayokong gawin yun kasi ang dami-daming content. Ayokong mapopulate yung isip nyo na kung ano-anong content na hindi naman necessary. Okay. Ayan, dami niya. So, basically, mas pipiliin nyo yung module na ginawa ko kasi mas kaunti lang siya at mas detail siya. Okay. So, yun. Okay. That's the presentation. Okay. So I will be uploading a task. Okay. So when I upload the exam, hindi na ako magbibigay ng additional module kasi ipipreserve ko na yun sa next period. But basically the coverage of our exam is the same. Data model, pero ang pinagkaiba, magbibigay na ako ng problem. So basically, I will be uploading this material, recorded material sa ating LMS, panoorin nyo na lang ulit. So, ito yung sample na problem na in-explain ko. Ayan. Ito yung kanya steps. Ayan, yung business rules at ito yung kanyang output. Okay. Ayan. So, yun. So, ito, meron akong task dito. I-upload ko to sa LMS mamaya para magawa nyo siya. And okay, may next lecture pa tayo. And ang coverage naman niya is yung logical model. So maybe next period pa siya, but ang focus nyo lang sa ngayon is to develop data model by creating the business rules. From business rules to data model. Ito, may second task ako, i-upload ko siya later para mapag-practicean nyo. So, yun lang muna sa ngayon. Okay, so, now, question tayo. Question. Meron bang tanong? Nandyan pa ba kayo? I will now stop